My throat's a little scratchy today, and I hope it won't be too troublesome as we go through this lecture. This is the last chapter in the Hutchison text, and it, as you might expect, deals with older adulthood. It's the array of slides that I have really aren't enough to justify splitting this into two, but they're probably a little bigger than many of the single lectures I've done. So bear with me, and well, hopefully you're not in too much of a hurry anyway, but I hope that the lecture will be not too terribly long that you lose interest in it. So in any event, as we talk about older adulthood, what we're really talking about in most all frames of reference is 65 and up. And that particular age is very, very arbitrary and maybe closely associated with the United States. When the Social Security Act was enacted in the mid 1930s, the retirement age was pictured to be 65. It has, since that time with revisions to the Social Security Code, you probably know, full retirement age is being pushed further up the ladder. Right now, I think the latest it would be for people born after 1960, I think, is 67 years of age. Individuals are able to retire with partial benefits at 62. So, if you think if you want to enjoy younger years and retire, you can take your Social Security retirement earlier than full retirement age, but your benefits are going to be reduced after that, so it's a debate about which is the wiser course. Most of what I've read suggested that taking benefits earlier is actuarially more sound than it is to wait till later. But in any event, the fact is that even for the purposes of retirement and benefits, pension benefits, the definition of old age really is kind of up in the air. And you probably know from yogurt commercials and different kinds of things that have been on the television over the years that there are individuals in their 90s in various parts of Russia and in the Ural Mountains somewhere that actually work well into their 80s. And so this idea, what is elderly, really varies from culture to culture, and certainly also has a lot to do with financial capabilities and things like this. These are things that we'll be talking about as we go along in this lecture. But this older adulthood covers about a quarter to a third of the person's life and includes a whole variety of people in terms of various stages of health and whether they're working or not. Old has many different meanings, and just like the difference between sex and gender, sex being biological, gender being a social construct, likewise you can divide age and aging in the same way, that aging is a biological process, and yet age itself is a social construct. What does age mean? Depends upon where you live and who you are and a variety of other things. It's interesting to note that the fastest growing segment of the aging population is said to be in the 85 and older group, which leads to a number of different considerations that we'll be touching on during the course of this lecture. But it's just very interesting to me that with our improved medical procedures and technologies and also I think a greater awareness of the kinds of things that contributes to longer life, people are just living a lot longer. A child born in 2011, the text says, could expect to reach an age of 78.7 years. If you're female, it's older than that. If you're male, it's a little younger than that, but that's the average life expectancy. But nonetheless, we have in the United States the shortest life expectancy of 17 different high income countries. So once again, just like infant mortality rate and a number of other social factors that we've talked about during the course of the semester, we're falling short here once again. One of the impacts of the extending our life is the dependency ratio changing, and it's shifting. At one time, there were a greater percentage of younger, that is, children and adolescents, in the mix of the balance between the working and non-working populations. But as that younger population percentage-wise has decreased, the older population has increased. And again, this has many different kind of social implications for our society, as we'll touch on and have touched on already during the course of the semester. There's a number of different things that explain increased life expectancy, which, first of all, the decreased mortality rate in children and young adults, the decreased mortality rate among older adults, and improvements in health technology, and a number of different other factors. As in virtually every social consideration that we have looked at this semester, race, gender, socioeconomic status has a lot to do with what your life expectancy will be. There is concern about the dependency rate, and this has something to do with or dependency ratio, and this has a lot to do, in fact, with all the worries about the Social Security fund going broke and those kinds of things. That is savable and salvageable, and there's a lot of naysayers that believe that the system can't possibly function, but it can. It is, in this society, a decision on our part to realign our values, and it can be done if we choose to do that. And but in any event, the idea, the belief is the dependency ratio. If you're projecting population rates of growth and this kind of thing, in about 20 years or so, it's going to end up kind of stabilizing at around 85 youth and elderly, that's the dependent portion, to 100 persons of working age, that is between the ages of 20 and 64. Now that's that puts quite a burden on the working age population, which is one of those social concerns we have these days. But in just a couple of years ago, 9% of the elderly were living in poverty. More of those individuals, I believe I remember correctly, the women were a larger portion of that, and men slightly smaller. Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that. Yes, higher rates for women, it says right there. And again, for almost all racial and ethnic minority populations, the rate is higher. So there is a very diverse population in the United States, and it's increasingly so. We may very well be the most diverse nation in the world as far as racial and ethnic considerations are looked at, and because of that, we really have to consider the fact that many of these cultures that exist, or subcultures perhaps, that exist within the United States, view aging, view all of these things we're going to talk about this week very differently. And the text refers to the contrast between traditional Chinese beliefs and mainstream United States beliefs and concerning age in the elderly. And it's just something to keep in mind as you work with various populations, and when you approach clients from other cultures, minority populations, those kinds of things. It's very, very important to realize that their views may not be the same as your own. While socioeconomic disparities certainly impact health outcomes as we age, there's a lot of studies that suggest that education has a greater impact than income on the onset of functional limitations or disabilities. We're going to talk more about that later in the lecture again, but it's just very interesting that education has such a big role in whether or not we function effectively as an older adult. And once again, of course, when you look at this from a socioeconomic standpoint, the more well-off, the more affluent individuals are going to be better able to access education, both in their youth as well as later in life, as I think we talked about in the last chapter about individuals being retrained. It was individuals in higher income groups who were able to do that. And so, again, you can look at this from a socioeconomic standpoint and realize that it isn't the same for everybody. Not everybody has the same opportunities here. There's different theories about aging. The social gerontology. I had a gerontology class in my bachelor's training. I don't know that you can find gerontology on the course schedule anywhere anymore. Maybe you can. I haven't seen it lately, but the gerontology is the social science that studies the aging process, human aging, and the textbook talks about 9 theories. There are probably other theories of aging as well, and just to touch on these briefly, one theory it's really kind of been disputed a good bit lately is the disengagement theory, and this theory suggests that as we get older, increasingly we sever our interactions, our social interactions, and our ties with others, and become more self-preoccupied. This has been disputed a good bit by thinkers more recently, and really is kind of a depressing kind of a theory when you look at aging, I think. Activity theory suggests that higher levels of activities and involvement in events in people's lives are directly related to higher levels of life satisfaction among the elderly. Continuity theory says that basically, however it is that we have adapted to changes throughout our lives, we're going to continue to use the same styles of coping in the older years, and if our roles are lost because of our age, we take on new roles. So we continue to function successfully, maybe just in different ways, but using the same styles of coping that we have had all along. Social constructionist theory, which I think we've touched upon here already, is that how we understand aging is shaped by our culture, our society, history, politics, economics, and these values that we have about aging are shaped by the various ways of understanding. Feminist theory looks at, as feminist theory generally does, looks at gender and sees this as a key factor in understanding aging, and how it impacts access and opportunity. That there is a lifelong condition of constrained choice for women, and that continues into retirement, and also results in a higher poverty rate for women among the elderly population as well. Social exchange theory says basically as we age, the resources that we bring into a relationship or into a situation are going to change. And if you think about, say, an elderly person living with their adult children, what resources do they bring? They may not be the most powerful person in the relationship anymore if you look at it from an economic standpoint. But then again, if they're able to provide an adult presence in the home so that supervision of children is no longer necessary, that becomes, from the adult standpoint, from the caregiving adult standpoint, then that becomes a very powerful resource that gives them a little more say-so, let's say, in the exchange of those relationships. We're studying the life course perspective, and that really looks at aging as this dynamic kind of process that depends upon so many different things. Just the tip of the iceberg, and historical placement of one's lives, the cohorts we belong to, environmental factors around us, all these kinds of things we've been talking about throughout the semester. And the life course perspective is the one that talks about life course capital, which is, if you have it, it's privilege. If you don't, it's oppression. Then the accumulation of life course capital impacts our aging process a great deal. Stratification perspective says that our society is stratified by age, and that the roles we get, the rights we have, all are based on our membership in various age cohorts. And the productive aging perspective puts more focus on the positive side of becoming older. It says that, we really spend too much time looking at, the negative things about getting older, and, we should be looking more upon the positive developments that come out of the aging process, including stronger sense of wisdom and those kinds of things. A few concepts or terms as far as biology goes and the changes. The text refers to primary aging versus secondary aging. Primary being these changes that are a normal part of the aging process, whereas secondary aging is caused by behaviors that we have engaged in that has compromised their health, such as smoking, excessive drinking, drug usage, those kinds of things, risk-taking behaviors, or the environmental factors around us, such as pollution and and those kinds of things. Also looks at the difference between the mortality and morbidity. So the mortality rate is the ratio of deaths in an area to the population of that area, whereas the morbidity rate would be the incidence of disease or illness. And so the mortality rate, the rate of death, is decreasing in the United States for all segments of the population over the last century, say since around the early 1900s, and yet the morbidity rate is increasing. And once again, depending upon race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, the chronic conditions may be prevalent or may not be. Certainly, the morbidity rate is going to increase to a certain extent as we get older, because more of those kinds of illnesses that inflict us later in life are going to be more prevalent. So that makes sense. But it's interesting to note that while the mortality rate has decreased all across the country, whether or not we're able to stay healthy as we get older really, again, has a lot to do with our what particular social groups we belong to. It's just really important things for social workers to keep in mind as we think about what we need to advocate for in terms of clients, and particularly our elder clients in this particular case. Here's a list of the leading causes of death for the individuals in the older adulthood group. And probably nothing in here that's any surprise to any of us that pay attention to these things. One of note is that the diabetes, and this refers to, type 2 diabetes has, I think, become a much larger issue in our society in the last 20 or 30 years. May or may not have something to do with how we eat, but it certainly has become a more prominent problem, and the increasing rate of obesity in our population has contributed to that. And it is, I think, said to be number 4 on the list among African Americans and Latinos, rather than number 6. And all systems of the body, and they're listed here for you, are impacted by the aging process. And not necessarily, no need for us to go into the changes that occur in each of those systems. I mean, there's brief references to that in the book, but suffice to say that, in general, the systems of the body begin to show signs of aging and continue to do so as life continues. So one of the things we're going to do as social workers when we're working with the elder population is perhaps being asked to do a functional assessment, and this is certainly not enough information to complete one, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of what it is that you're going to be looking at if you ever do functional assessments. And they're really activities are divided into those that are necessary for daily living, basic care activities, they're referred to as ADLs here, and then the activities that aren't necessary but really help us to live independently, and those are the instrumental activities of daily living. And the needs for assistance in both area increases steadily with age. I kind of worded the bottom when it says that the ability decreases with age, but it both means the same thing, that increasingly we need assistance in these areas as we get older. And these are just some of the areas of functioning that will tell you whether or not an individual is able to live independently or needs assistance. By the way, I added computer in the list of instrumental activities. The text just says using the telephone, and yeah, I suppose that's all really what it's talking about, is being able to pick up the phone and call for help if you need it, and to stay connected with other people. So you don't really have to have a smartphone for that purpose, but more and more individuals have smartphones, including older persons, and the computer has become a very, very important means for individuals who are homebound. So I think the more computer literate elderly people are, the better it's going to be for them in terms of being able to stay in touch as well. What's going on with the functions? The brain, it says between the ages of 20 and 90, which is a big range of years, but the brain loses somewhere between 5 and 10% of its weight during those years, and most of this loss is in the frontal lobe, where it's our behavior, our learning, our personality, and the hippocampus, which is the center of our emotion and memory. Those are the areas that are most affected by this decrease in volume of the brain. But that plasticity comes in here again. That adults can compensate and adapt to age-related brain changes as functions get reorganized as the brain ages. We talked about that some. I talked about that some in the last chapter as well, when I think was the concept of bilateralization going on in the brain, where older individuals begin to use both sides of the brain rather, when in the past, one particular area of the brain may have been the focus for certain activities. There are 3 neurodegenerative diseases that are mentioned in the text. Dementia, which is when our mental and cognitive abilities deteriorate, and sometimes it's so gradual that it goes unnoticed. It's of interest to note, by the way, that most of those people that have dementia live in low-income countries. So again, this tells you about the importance of socioeconomics in related to health and development. Alzheimer's is a more severe form of dementia, I suppose, and it says that it represents about 70% of the dementia cases. And the text breaks down symptoms connected to 3 different stages of the Alzheimer's disease, and it is a pretty sneaky disease. And as I'm sure you realize, we really don't know a lot about Alzheimer's right now. I mean, there's a lot of research going on about it. More research could be done. This is where I think accessing fetal tissue for testing and things like this is one area that stem cell research, that kind of thing, where it may be very instrumental in uncovering the process of Alzheimer's and finding ways to cure it. But anyway, that's another debate in our society. It relates back to the values we have in our society about, well, the people that maintain the importance of life, perhaps not recognizing the importance of older life in this particular case. But in any event, there's a belief that the changes that are going on in the brain are happening 10 to 20 years before the disease is even noticed. And if you're familiar with your presidential history at all, Ronald Reagan, who did eventually develop Alzheimer's and died from Alzheimer's disease, began to show some, looking back in his administration during his second term in particular, there were some signs of early Alzheimer's in the way he was functioning, in the way he was talking, and those kinds of things. And in fact, there's been some talk about President Trump also using big general terms, like using the word thing a lot in his discussion, which is an indication of some reduction in cognitive capacities and those kinds of things. That's not necessarily saying it's Alzheimer's, but in any event, we've had a few fairly public persons, that have developed this illness. And if you have it in your own family, you know how dreadfully difficult it can be for the family and for the caretaker to watch their loved one just gradually lose control of their personality and lose their personality and soon be able to not recognize people and those kinds of things. There's been some medications found to slow the progression of the disease, but nothing yet to cure it. Hopefully research will continue and find some success in that area. Parkinson's disease, there are some drugs available now that have been successful in reducing the symptoms of this illness, not curing it yet. But this is the chronic and progressive loss of control of movement. Usually occurs in adults over 70, but does occur much earlier. One of the most famous of the Parkinson's victims, as you probably know, is the actor Michael J. Fox. And the symptoms include tremors and slower movements, some insecure gait, slower walking, that kind of thing. But interestingly, also these symptoms are also part of the normal aging process. So sometimes it's difficult to tell one from the other. As far as Erickson's lifespan theory, his 8 stages of man, we are talking here about the eighth and final stage in his in his system, which is the ego integrity versus ego despair, or integrity versus despair. Integrity in this particular case refers to the ability to make peace with one's one and only life cycle and to find unity with the world. Interesting to note, I have read that Erickson and his wife, and I think it may have been his second wife, were actually, they lived, I think, into their late 80s or early 90s, I don't know, but were actually working on the development of a ninth stage at the time that he died. So it was never completed, at least to my knowledge. No one has picked that up. But this is the last stage in his 8 stages of man, as he refers to it. 8 stages of the human life cycle. There's some talk about the different kinds of intelligence when we look at intellectual changes and learning. Fluid intelligence, the capacity for abstract reasoning, and involves things like the ability to respond quickly and memorize quickly and do things, compute quickly, that kind of thing. And there is a belief that as an individual ages, this capacity declines. The other kind of intelligence they're referring to here, crystallized intelligence, really is based on accumulations of lessons and learning, and the ability to reflect and recognize rather than to recall and remember. Think about that. The ability to reflect and recognize rather than recall and remember. Different processes there. And crystallized intelligence is believed to increase with age. So loss of intelligence isn't necessarily a part of growing older. Now, when you look at memory, there's a wide degree of variability in terms of memory performance in this stage of life. And the text, and again, not being a brain expert here, I'm not going to be able to go into great detail about this, but information processing is, it's really kind of a complicated theory, and information processing theory sees several stages of memory. Here are the 5. That instant memory, the sensory memory, which is, if you don't attend to something immediately, like in a split second, you don't remember it, you don't notice it, and so it really, what you pay attention to matters a lot, and there's not much change in this capacity as we age. Primary, which is considered recent memory, there's not a lot of change related to age progression as far as decline is concerned. Working memory is the ability to use those recent memories, short-term memories, so to speak, and there is some age-related decline. So while the memory is there, your capacity to make use of the short-term memory becomes somewhat compromised. Longer-term memory, recall does seem to decline some with age, but that remote memory, tertiary memory, there's little age-related changes in this area. So I don't know. If I look at this, makes me think that this might be one reason why older people perhaps remember things way back when, but may not have such a great memory for things that have just happened or things in recent history. I don't know. I think it depends. And an information processing specialist may tell you that's not a good interpretation of this. But in any event, suffice it to say that memory isn't this kind of monolithic thing that just declines. There are some areas where declines are really pretty limited, and again, different kinds of memory, those things that we intend to remember and those things that we happen to learn without intention. And the things we intend to remember, that capacity, intentional memory, does not seem to decline with age, while the other does. And again, as we talked about earlier, brain plasticity really allows the older person's brain to rewire itself to concept's not the word that belongs in there, but to rewire itself to compensate, I believe, is what I'm looking for the loss of functioning in particular regions of the brain. It might even be possible that the older person's brain is generating new cells. Not a lot said about mental health and mental disorders. They're adults are at greater risk for developing brain diseases, but it's not really a part of the normal aging process. And without brain disease, most adults find that mental health improves with age. I don't know, just become more content and whatever those psychological disturbances are that have occurred throughout life just seem to dissipate to a certain extent. But still, about maybe 3/4 of older adults who need mental health services aren't getting them. So something again for you to keep in mind as we practice with older people. Spend a little bit of time looking at role transitions, social role transitions, and life events in late adulthood. And for instance, the families and grandparenthood. Over a quarter of non-institutionalized older adults in the United States live by themselves. I think it's safe to say that the older the adult becomes, the less likely they are to be able to live alone in their own home. But many continue to function independently for quite a long time. More men live with their wives in older age. It says here 72% of men over 65 live with their spouse. Now, women have longer lifespans than men on average, and so this makes sense that there would be more widows than widowers, and so more men have a spouse to live with, or older men. Older women tend to have closer and more important family relationships with the extended family than do older men, generally speaking. And the text points out very rightfully, especially for those older adults who may be living in the home with their adult children and grandchildren, but even those that don't live with them, that in the exchange in the relationship, talking about exchange theory a little while ago, that the intergenerational exchanges aren't necessarily one way. It isn't just the adult children taking care of their older adults. The older adults are still, at least those that are healthy and have their capacities about them, are still contributing to the household in different ways. It might be financial. It could be in terms of babysitting or supervision. It could be in time, in different kinds of things like that. And so again, this isn't just a take relationship. Of course, more and more people are, as they live longer, becoming grandparents and great-grandparents and even great-great-grandparents. I am still relatively young in the older adult age range, but some of my friends are already great-grandparents, and it just blows my mind to think about that, but that's what's going on. And I suppose, I think my oldest grandchild is 16 years old, 17 now, I think, and so could be me anytime now. Most grandparents don't live with their grandchildren, but they still play a very important role in their grandchildren's life in many different ways, or at least they can. Not all do, but many can. The whole notion about retirement has changed in the last 100 years, and once again varies from culture to culture. But until the 20th century, it says the average worker retired just about 3 years before death. But now because well, I think we're working longer, we're living longer, and also Social Security legislation makes it possible to retire at a decent age, one where you have a good number of years left. We're retiring so that we have a longer retirement, and so there's a lot of considerations about retirement that maybe our society didn't deal with 100 or so years ago. Again, the pattern of retirement varies a lot with social class. So individuals in the working class and lower socioeconomic groups are going to work longer. Oftentimes they don't have pension plans, or they don't have the capacity to put money aside for their own retirement. And so without a nest egg, you're really left with little choice but to continue working. Or if you are lucky enough to have an adult child that can take you in and take care of you, that may be a different matter. But retirement is in many ways a lifestyle and or a problem, if it's a problem, for the more affluent individuals among us, I believe. I mean, those of us in the middle class and above. Pensions have changed, and pensions, whereas even in state employment, for instance, those individuals that were hired before the 1990s or the early 2000s had what's referred to as a defined benefit program that you put into retirement, the state puts into your retirement fund, and based on the number of years of service and the amount of money that was put in, you wind up with a benefit that's predictable every month for the rest of your life. But retirement systems are changing now, including with the state, so that they have what's called a defined contribution plan, which is just like any other retirement savings account in a 401a or 401c account, where you put in money and you manage that money, and depends on how the stock market goes as to whether or not, how much money you're going to have in the end. And it's interesting, the retirement bundle that is still left for me with the university, which I won't access until I stop teaching, is a 401a, and so I watch that amount go up and down with the stock market, and so it's a different consideration there. Whereas when I retired from the state of Alaska, I knew what my monthly check would be, and also I drew a small retirement from Florida because I worked down there a number of years before I moved north. Those things aren't available now for a lot of people, and so the question of retiring isn't going to be quite so automatic anymore. And with perhaps the instability of the Social Security program, again, I have more faith in that program continuing, and then sometimes Facebook's going to tell you, but even still, with just the uncertainty about that, what retirement, when you all may be retiring, may look differently in a 20 years from now. I don't know. I hope not. I hope there's been a movement afoot, for instance, with the state, to go back to a defined benefit plan, but they haven't had a lot of success with that in the last 10 years or so. So one of the things that happens because of that is that people don't just retire and never work again. At least not everybody, and including yours truly. Some people do retire and cease work completely. One of my brothers has done that. Of my 4 older brothers, two of them. My brother, I have an older brother, I think I've mentioned to you, that it's a priest, and he has been able to retire till he's 75, so he's not going back to work, although he does occasionally get called in to help out. But for the rest of my brothers, the 3 other brothers who were kind of out there in the regular workaday world or whatever with me, one of them has retired and has not gone back to work at all, but the other 2 retired and either went back to work for their company part-time or worked for some contractors for their company part-time over the years. And that's continued with part-time or part-year employment, which is something that, of course, I'm doing as I'm teaching now. Others leave work and stay out of the workforce for a while and then return to full-time employment later. So there's just a number of different ways people retire anymore. And again, your gender has something to do with, aside from your socioeconomics here, your gender has a lot to do with how your retirement's going to be as well. Because if you have gender inequality in wages as a young person during your working years, then you're probably going to have gender inequality in terms of pension or retirement payments later on in life, just because you didn't have as much money. And so this is one reason why older women are at greater risk for poverty. It's something we need to change in our society. I just can't understand how we can go ahead with gender inequality in the workforce, and somehow people justify paying women less for the same work that men get. I just don't understand that. So, what about older adults when they need caregiving? Well, first of all, only about 1 in 10 rely exclusively on formal care, and so almost three-quarters of individuals rely exclusively on informal care. That is the help of people in their families or their friends or whatever. Now, this can be very taxing on caregivers, and if you are working with individuals that require around the clock care or even part time care, um, look very closely at how things are going with the caregiver, because the caregiver oftentimes, even if they say they are devoted to their loved one, there's a lot of stress associated with caregiving with elderly and disabled individuals. Be sure those persons get services that allow them to get some respite and to take care of themselves, whether it's a couple of days a week or whatever, a few hours a day, or a few days a month, or however that might work. Respite care is something that can be very, very vital for them. um, Here's a list of some factors that predict a person's entry into a nursing home, into full-time care, and you'll notice that, of course, it's all about declining health and functional capacities, and one's age and that kind of thing, but also family characteristics, and whether or not the caregiver feels capable of providing continued care, whether the caregiver has the health and the mental status necessary to do so. That's something, if you remember from reading I think the Rosenhan article mentioned this, perhaps not, but I remember reading one time about admissions to psychiatric hospitals, that it was much less the decision of the psychiatrist whether or not an individual would be admitted to a facility, as it was the caregiving adult, if it was a child, the parent, or if it was a grown adult, the person that person lived with. And finally, this individual did something that kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and the caregiver said, "I can't do this anymore," and the psychiatrist says, "Okay," and admits the person to the facility. And I think to a certain extent this can also be true about institutionalizing individuals in a nursing home. I know a couple who have been caring for the legally blind and rapidly deteriorating elder brother of the woman in this relationship, and he's been living in his own apartment. I don't think it's necessarily even an assisted living. I don't think it's assisted living. I think it was just his own apartment, but around other elderly people. And he was doing fine, but a year or two ago, he started doing things like picking up the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning and calling the caregiving couple and saying, "It's Wednesday morning. Aren't we supposed to go somewhere?" And that kind of thing. And this just continued and continued, and he would fall and wouldn't be able to get to the phone for them, and just resisted institutionalization for a long time. And this couple talked to me about this, and one of the things I mentioned to them is I know I know how social workers work, and one of the things we're going to do is look for alternatives to to institutionalizing an individual. If there's someone out there that can keep that person possibly functioning, safely. Now, I wouldn't say they do this to risk the individual's health, but if they can keep this person functioning independently, they're going to make use of that resource. And so I just told this couple, be sure that the worker you talk to is very clear that you cannot do it anymore. And he was admitted, and he's still there. So I think And I'm not saying there's anything invalid about that at all. I think, the ability of the resource to care for the elderly person is certainly got to be a major factor in determining whether or not the elderly person needs to be institutionalized. So we go through this life review. I just don't like that term, but it's this process of evaluating and making sense of one's life. And I think this really connects with Erickson's eighth stage again, integrity versus despair. Does the individual come to accept one's self and see life as having been meaningful, or does the individual reject the self and the life that person has lived? This is something that's going on as aging process continues. Now, research has found that humans tend to become more spiritual as they get older. Somewhere between their mid 50s and the mid 70s in one study it was suggested. In another study it was less obvious, but I think it's pretty clear that spirituality takes on a new meaning. Religiosity perhaps takes on a new meaning as one begins to approach the end of life and loses loved ones around them. Just like there's formal caregiving and informal caregiving, the resources that are out there for our elderly clients are both formal and informal. Formal resources oftentimes have eligibility requirements. You have to kind of go through this screening process, and sometimes they're not very affordable. And so oftentimes the elderly person has to rely more upon those informal resources that remember that natural helping network we talked about some weeks ago. This is where this comes in: family, friends, church members, that kind of thing. Now, a little bit just about some of the terms you run into, and these are probably terms you're familiar with, maybe not. Power of attorney, which is the legal arrangement by which a person appoints another person to manage financial affairs and any other affairs that become important. And these powers may be very limited in scope or limited in time, or can be, very all-encompassing and long-lasting. And so that's just something that can be done. Sometimes individuals, if an adult has already apparently lost their mental capacities, some individuals will go into court and ask the court to give them power of attorney or declare them a guardian for the disabled elderly adult, and it will be up to the court to decide whether or not that person is able to manage their own affairs. As we approach death, there's questions about advance directives. That what is it that if something happens to me, what do I want done? Do I want to be kept on life support or not? Where's the line? Who should speak for me? That kind of thing. And the living will is, I think, much the same thing as an advance directive. There are some differences, I think, but the living will is maybe a little more thorough. Palliative care is the form of care that focuses on pain and symptom management as opposed to curing a disease. Palliative care does not necessarily mean hospice. It doesn't have the requirements that hospice care does, that I'll talk about here in a second, but really kind of focuses more upon the comfort of the patient rather than seeking a cure. Hospice care is one model of palliative care, and I think this is for individuals that are, well, I know that generally you have to be, you have a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, and the individuals signing on for this person's hospice care, or the individual in hospice themselves, have to agree that they're no longer going to pursue a cure. I had a friend whose elderly mother was in hospice, and he was very conflicted about this. She needed the service so badly, but he felt very much like he was being asked to say, okay, we give up. And when some hope appeared that there might be something that could help her situation, and he mentioned the hospice nurse, she said that if you pursue this, we have to stop providing service. And I'm not even sure if they could go back in for a period of time. It just was really tough situation for individuals making this decision. You're familiar with Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, and there are other models, but this is the one that's endured. I think this model is 50 years old now. I remember writing a paper about this when it was still relatively new in my bachelor's training. And we have over the years come to recognize that this stages of grief isn't just about losing a loved one to death, but has to do with a lot of processes, including kids going into foster care placements, or losing a job, or losing a very important relationship in your life, those kinds of things. So really this process, and as the text points out, it isn't that once you've finished denial and you go into anger, you never go back to denial again, or vice, and so on. Sometimes people move back and forth between these stages, and that's why there are some other, I'm going to talk about in a minute, some other ideas about how to look at grief. The textbook, I don't mean to chuckle at this and sound like it's facetious, but lists these kinds of things that you see in a dying person, that they're dying. And I'm not going to go into that here. It's you can look in the text if you want to, but it's just an interesting little information box to have in a textbook. We talk about the differences between the loss, losing an attachment to a loved one, versus bereavement, which is having suffered a loss, the state you're in; grief, which is the internal reaction to individual experiences while they're bereaved, and the mourning processes, which is this extended expression of grief. Now, one of the things, it's often a question, and by the way, cultural traditions and rituals, as it says here, really guide how we deal with deaths. If you, cultures in the Middle East, for instance, sadly, as we look at, as the horror in the Middle East, that's going on, and you look at funerals resulting from that, and there's an outpouring. I mean, just a very vocal kind of grief going on as they carry the body to the grave, and also burial in a lot of religions has to be within 24 hours, and all those kinds of things. So the processes that, if we're talking about an individual in the United States from another culture, the processes that we go through, like for instance in sending a body to the medical examiner for an autopsy, may very well violate the very important religious tenets of the client's religion. So this is something that you should be aware of also. We need to be aware of as we work with elderly people and their families. But, our culture, the kind of traditional WASP culture in the United States really kind of, will be strong is that kind of the message, that we get. Your brother wouldn't want you sitting around and crying all the time. He'd want you to be out happy and dancing. And we deny ourselves the opportunity to really process grief in this society, in our culture, and it's something that I think it's just something we could work on here and do better at. We're very stuffy and we're very predictable, and while that ritual we have over the course of usually 3 days, from death into burial, give or take. That ritual has some comfort in it for those of us that know what to expect when we have a loss, but the way we're expected to deal with our feelings isn't healthy in our culture at all. And here's a list of some of the things we have when we lose, the kind of things we experience. Rather than looking at the stages of grief, there is another approach to looking at this that talks about the tasks of mourning, which seems almost more useful. When you look at this list, I mean, this makes a lot of sense on a human basis. I think we need to accept the reality of the loss. That is, work through the denial, basically, work through the pain of grief, which doesn't mean stuffing it. Adjusting to the environment in which the deceased is missing. In other words, getting on with life without that person, and find this to be an interesting turn of phrase, to emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life, but which I think means basically, well, to find another niche in our heart for that person, perhaps, rather than being front and center all the time. And for an individual, by the way, as far as what's a normal length of grief, some people, as this pattern of grieving lists, suggests, some people really don't experience grief, and it isn't necessarily unhealthy. There may be many reasons for that. Maybe it's unhealthy, if it's delayed, inhibited, or suppressed. That's a different issue. But sometimes people just don't experience the grief as absent. And there's normal or uncomplicated grief, and there's chronic or prolonged grief. Now, what is too long for a grieving period is really, it depends on the individual, it depends on the culture, it depends on the circumstance. But one person may be able to get ready, the day after the funeral, for instance, to get on with life, go back to work, and just kind of push through. Other individuals eventually return to the daily routine, but continue grieving, visiting the grave frequently, and maybe having periods of tearfulness and everything for years. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's unhealthy or that it's got any kind of a psychological issue to it. We all grieve differently, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think, when over an extended period of time the grief keeps an individual from functioning in life and fulfilling roles that need to be filled, that's perhaps when we need to look at whether the grief has reached some dysfunctional levels. But the fact that people maybe take some time aside, set time aside for weeks and months, even years after the loss of a loved one, to think about the person and to cry over the loss of the person, everything like that. I mean, if otherwise, life is going on, there's nothing abnormal about that. So, make sure you understand before we begin talking to any members of any cultural group about grief, loss, and dying, what their particular beliefs are, what their particular rituals are, that kind of thing. And that means you have to listen to them first, using open-ended questions, and being receptive to the fact that our way of grieving isn't necessarily the healthiest or the best way to go about that. We don't want to judge other person's ideas about what they should feel or do, and recognize when there are cultural conflicts, respect the decisions of the individuals and their choices. As far as risk and protective factors for the elderly, this is every chapter in the book. This section gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and I think this one didn't even get a whole column, if I remember correctly. It's just kind of interesting, but the factors are pretty much the same as they did get a whole column, but that's about it. I mean, they're pretty much the same as they've been the whole way through life development as far as risk and protective factors go. But here are some things that predict healthy aging, and really this has a lot to do with lifestyle as much as anything else. But remember also that a happy childhood, it predicts a happy life throughout your life. Also, that sense of generativity. I think it's mentioned somewhere in this chapter as well that sense of generativity in middle adulthood is also something that predicts a positive adjustment in late adulthood as well. Makes sense. Erickson would tell you, well, you got to complete that task to move on to the next task. But these kinds of things are all things that are going to make the older adult resilient and healthy, and hopefully allow that individual to enjoy the hopefully many years that they have ahead of them. Just some, a closing thought or two that that the author gives us is for the whole life course. That but particularly with the elderly, considering the elderly, that the size and inevitability of aging of the baby boom generation is going to drive public policy debate and hopefully improve services for very late in life adults. There's going to be a need for social workers working with individuals in this particular age group, and also advocating for them. And that means, for instance, protecting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid for the those in poverty and that aren't quite old enough for Medicare, and so on. Women are going to continue to live longer than men from all indications. The more education an individual achieves throughout their life is going to contribute to the capacity for them to live longer, and so we can expect that educational attainment levels of the very late life adult are going to increase as well. Look at this, 6th-generation families are going to be common. 6 generations, so that's, let's see, that's a great, if I get this right, great grandchildren. Fewer family caregivers will be available for very late in life adults, as this baby boom population, of which I'm a member, ages and becomes late in life. There is a smaller group following us, and some of those individuals will live longer, some of them won't, but there will be fewer individuals there to take care of us. So remember me when you're when you're a middle age, and check up on me. Make sure I got somebody, okay? And finally, management of healthcare education, all of that's going to be more and more available over the internet, the television, all these different kinds of ways that telemedicine, that have become a part of our culture and our world now, that will extend services to individuals who are homebound or who are in more remote locations, that kind of thing. And so keep that in mind also when you think about designing your practice and the various parts of this that you might want to incorporate. I still find it, this is a little off the topic, but it's just amazing that we're seeing advertisements on television for individual therapy by text message, and it's just wow, that's just something we would never have imagined. Insurance companies aren't paying for that yet, by the way, but there are people who are paying for it apparently, because there's a lot of those services out there, and I'm guessing that the persons that are providing the therapy have the credentials to do that, but who would have ever imagined something like that? It's Sigmund Freud must be turning over in his grave. So, when we're working with older adults, keep that person's life history in mind. Know how you feel about the aging process, and how maybe different ideas about what aging is all about. Go back to those 9 theoretical perspectives about the process, and which ones make the most sense to you. Because they're going to influence your practice. If you're really kind of focused on the negative side of the aging process, that may make it more difficult for you to work comfortably with this population. Be conscious of how social roles change over time as persons age, and also how they vary depending upon what age cohort the person belongs to. Look for ways to help the elderly client prepare for future problems or avoid those problems. Look for the differences in the physical, biological, psychosocial, socio-emotional realms, and these things that are part of the normal aging process, but also try to develop the capacity to recognize when there's something that is outside the norm and might be indicative of a problematic process developing. And then Alzheimer's is a good indication of that. Now, it's normal, as we've talked about earlier. It's very normal for persons to, for instance, recall of names and words and things like that. That's a very normal part of the aging process as the brain changes. And so it's hard to say, oh, this looks like early Alzheimer's, or as this chapter says, this looks like early, early something else. It's just, it's really hard to know what you're looking at, but just keep those things in mind as you work with clients and be assessing for the possibility that there could be something more serious developing. And again, hopefully, medical science is going to come up with some dramatic advancements in terms of dealing with some of these illnesses and diseases of the aging process. But as they do that, keep in mind there's going to be other issues arise as we continue to live longer and longer and longer. Those centenarians, and I think super centenarians, the ones that are over 110 years of age, it's amazing. And there's likely to be more of those in the years ahead. And so how are we going to accommodate those persons? Retirement is, something you want to be aware of if you're working with individuals at that age, and know about that process. Understand that for some people, retirement is a joyous period where it's something they've been working for and they're very happy to ease into that and not work. For others, it's the loss of the central part of their identity, and can really set up a terrible grief process. And so know how your clients are adjusting differently to the transition. Keep an eye on what's going on with the elderly person's caregiving network, and pay attention to the difficulties the caregivers are having as well, and be familiar with what kind of support programs are out there for them. Also know how you go about institutionalizing an older adult if you're working with this population, and understand how the process adapting to a nursing home might be. I know an older individual who he's in his mid 80s, and no one, he just kind of, I don't know what exactly happened, but he wound up in a coma, and he was just totally in a coma for like 3 weeks or so. And at 85, everybody was saying, this is it, he's not going to come back. And he came back, and he went from the hospital to an intensive care facility to an assisted living facility, and was back out in his own home about 3 months ahead of time, 3 months of what he was supposed to be. Just an amazing person. Still lives 2 years later, is still living. And I remember taking another person about 10 years younger over to see him in the assisted living facility, and I thought the facility looked great, and it was just a very happy and cheerful place, and the person who was with me says, this is just the place where people are all sitting here waiting to die. And, he didn't ever want to be put in a facility like this. Well, that doesn't have to be that way, but many people view it that way. And so be ready to kind of listen to how that person views this process as well. So that ties up the human life course and my lectures for this semester, in fact. So I appreciate it if you've been listening to me all along and putting up with this. I really do appreciate your patience, and once again hope that I've been of some benefit in your education. It's certainly a pleasure to be a part of your professional development. It means a lot to me to be there for that, and hope that our lives cross again. So take care, and we'll be in touch.